Uh,
Boom! And welcome everybody to SPSM Chat at a special time with a special guest. I am Dr. Bart Andrews. As you will notice, this is unusual. There is no Doc Foreman on the show today. Is this a first, Tony? Tony, this might
Very
be
first.
This is the first time in the history of SPSM that there is no Doc Foreman present on the show. Tony can attest to this. There's been times in the past where Doc Foreman has said she wouldn't be on the show.
Yep.
And that she would stay in the background and just let us do it.
Yep.
But she was incapable. Is that correct, Tony? She was incapable.
I don't know if she was incapable, but she certainly did show up and host the entire show.
Yeah, she did. She did.
So she even was here when she said she wasn't going to be here, except this time she's on a plane.
She's on a plane, so she really can't get at us this time. So it's ours to do what we want. It'll never be the same again.
No.
So you guys know me at Bart Andrews, Vice President of Clinical Practice and Evaluation at a groovy crisis agency in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm really excited to be here. We have a super important guest tonight, and I can't wait to introduce him, but we're going to wait. We're going to start with Tony Wood.
Hello, everybody. I'm Tony Wood. I'm the chair of the board of the American Association of Suicidology, suicidology.org. And I am also the COO of Quantify, a software company, let's call them, dedicated to mental health and mental well-being. Jonathan Singer.
hey, y'all. Jonathan Singh, Associate Professor at Loyola University. I am the select American Association of Suicidology. I'm at O'Hare Airport because I'm also about to catch a plane. I'm going to Jersey. Tomorrow I'm giving an LGBTQ youth suicide risk and schools for Bergen County. I'm the author of Suicide in Schools, founder and host of a short podcast, and I'm on the board of a mental health app called Docs. And if it seems like I'm in a war zone, I'm not. I'm just moving around. And I'm looking forward to today's conversation.
Jonathan, show him what Rob had you do. Show us what it looks like when you're running, because that was a great effect. Do it.
Okay, here we go. I'm taking off down the airport.
Yeah.
Oh, this is great television.
Good stuff. Thank you, Jay. And Jay, because he's in, that's good. We can go ahead. Yep. Okay. I'm going to bring up Rob. Rob, so please, we're so excited about having you on the show, and we have a lot to talk about. Please introduce yourself to the group. Tell them where they can reach you on Twitter and who you are.
Sure. I'm Rob Morris, and I'm currently co-founder of a company called Koko, which came out of my research at MIT, where I did my master's and PhD degrees. I have a background in psychology, so prior to being a kind of hacker designer, I did my undergrad and clinical research training in psychology. And I'm on Twitter at Robert R. Morris.
Thank you, sir. I'm very excited to have you here. And I think for folks who are following along, there's a great article in The Verge that does a pretty in-depth, it's a really detailed story about how this all got started. So if folks want some background. But Rob, one of the things I'm curious about, I mean, I know my own origin story. How did you get interested in psychology in general? I know that you did your bachelor's in psychology. What hooked you in? What was that kind of key thing that got you down that path?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually started in college pretty deep in the humanities. So I was an aspiring Russian lit major. And I think, Tolstoy is one of the great psychologists. And, most of our discussions were sort of dancing around some of these core psychological issues, but doing so in a way that had no sort of methodological rigor. And I was very attracted to, I think, psychology as sort of an adjacent field, and then fell in love with it. I've, long dealt with mental health problems myself. So I think, like many of us in this field, there's sort of a personal motivation there as well. But yeah, I've tried to escape psychology a few times, but it's been sort of my persistent passion for well over a decade and more.
So it keeps coming back. You tried to get away, and it keeps dragging you back in, AKA Godfather 3, right?
Correct.
So it's a couple interesting things in that. One, you mentioned Tolstoy, and I had no idea until I read War and Peace. That's Tolstoy, right? Do I have that right?
Mm-hmm.
And he does this amazing piece at the end that's one of the most riveting psychological interpretations of history I've ever seen. And he
Yeah.
talks about how in history we're so quick to focus on individuals instead of the environment that people are in, right? And I was like, this guy, this is really good stuff. And he wrote this a long time ago. I wish we would have been paying closer attention when he actually said those things. When you were finishing your bachelor's degree, obviously you must have at some point been thinking about clinical psychology or doing something like that. You chose a different path. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I was always a bit of a misfit in psych departments, and when I later was doing some research, so I did some fMRI research in clinical neuroimaging at Harvard a little bit, and then Mass General Hospital, and I was always sort of trying to hack together stuff. So as an undergrad, one thing we had to do was pick an advisor for our senior thesis, and I would show up to these meetings to try and get an advisor, and I'd have all these cables and microphones, and I'd be like, I'm going to do this psychophysiological experiment where we measure your heart rate from your wrist and all this, kind of insane things. And everyone would kind of look at me and say, well, this is maybe better for an engineering project or thesis, but I was, terrified of math. I didn't take any engineering classes, so it took me a long, long time to realize that I'm a designer and a builder at heart. And I think that's ultimately what led me to MIT. And I was fortunate enough to be at a place within MIT called the Media Lab, which is a very cross-disciplinary section of MIT. And they let me, bring my interest in psychology and my interest in digital mental health tools and interventions and combine that with cutting-edge technology and design. And the other thing that was so great about MIT was, they really sort of poo-pooed any kind of incremental work. So there was a huge kind of push to do something brazen and could have catastrophic failure associated with it, which is something I really enjoy. So it was a pretty good fit for me, though it definitely was an adjustment. I had never taken an engineering course. I'd written like one line of code, and here I was at this institution where they were expecting me to be a world-class coder right out of the gates. So it was pretty petrifying few years actually at MIT.
Okay, so that's a big step. You go from a psychology program into this really advanced kind of IT multidisciplinary media lab at MIT. And my guess is that the demands were really intense and the learning curve was really intense. What was that like for you making that adjustment?
It was very difficult. I think that, the hard thing was, I think the brain is just a sort of natural social comparison engine. No matter how hard you try to say, well, I have this different background, I'm going to bring something unique to this program. It doesn't matter if I'm not the best coder, and I'll learn eventually. But when you're in an office with two people that are running circles around you at every turn, just insanely brilliant coders and engineers, it can be devastating to be sort of in that position. And I think, there was a lot of pressure to produce working prototypes. So I had to learn incredibly quickly. But fortunately, by the time I was at MIT, there was, this just Cambrian explosion of online tutorials and online resources. I think before, a few years before, I would have had to actually take courses or actually, read giant tomes about C++ or something. So there were a lot of tools at my disposal that made my entry, albeit pretty rough, a little bit more delicate than it needed to be.
So this is important because you're describing a lot of things, and there's things I'm going to circle back to, because this whole idea of incremental change and having incremental solutions to our mental health and suicide problem, it ain't gonna fix it. We're not gonna make any progress. But you're also talking about this idea of self-agency and folks kind of using crowdsourcing and folks using apps and available resources just to anybody to better themselves or improve things. And I think that there's a good connection there to how you ended up creating this amazing thing called Koko. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, so the story of that goes, so I'm at MIT, I'm trying to write code, my code is failing day after day after day. I think, you know, one thing people should know is when you start to learn to write code, it's like 99% failing, which I wasn't really prepared for. And it was very stressful, but I did have this resource which was called Stack Overflow. So this is a sort of online question and answer site for computer programmers. It's a place where if you have a bug in your code, you can go on the site, you can describe what's going on, and within minutes, this hive of computer programmers will come to your rescue and give you these amazing solutions all for free. It's this real beautiful marvel of collective intelligence. On the surface, it looks just like a forum or typical discussion forum, but there's an incredible amount of subtlety and nuance to get it to work as well as it does. So it was a fantastic resource for me, but it did fail me in a pretty big respect. And that was, you know, the biggest stress of learning to code was not, you know, necessarily the bugs in my code, it was the bugs in my thinking. It was, oh, I'm a failure because my code is failing. I can't make it here, etc. So, you know, the kind of insight that leapt out at me, you know, as someone who had a background in things like CBT and cognitive therapy, was, well, this program is so great at debugging, you know, my code. Can I use some of the same principles, these principles of leveraging collective intelligence and designing really exquisite systems to eke out collective intelligence? Can we apply that to help me sort of debug my thoughts, debug my brain? Because I think, you know, even though I had experienced something like cognitive therapy, both as a academic, but as a patient as well, you know, I found there's some shortcomings with it. And one of the things that, you know, I kind of agree with is referenced in Andrew Solomon's book on depression. He writes, he kind of gives a jab at CBT where he says, it's really hard to wrestle with your own consciousness when the only tool in that battle is your consciousness itself. So I wanted some system to help me sort of refresh my skills and give me an incentive to do it and act as sort of a prosthetic when I was, you know, so stressed that my ability to think flexibly, no matter how much training I had, was just impaired.
So this experience you had using Stack Overflow and getting support there, and also having the insight that this isn't just about my technical skill, it isn't just about the bugs in my program, but it's about my mindset and how I'm thinking about these problems that's creating a lot of stress for me. And wouldn't it be great if I could get help with that? Because it's really hard to help myself with those sorts of things. What's a way to do that? And maybe use a crowdsourcing approach to solve that problem. That sounds like how it kind of got you into this idea of, and is it a Panoply? Is that the first thing that you created? Tell folks, yeah, please tell folks about, because I think this is genius, and I don't say that lightly. Please tell folks about Panoply.
Okay, yeah, so, you know, I immediately started prototyping this thing, and it was something I was doing on my own. I didn't tell my academic advisor. I was really sort of building it for myself at that point. And what I did was I used this sort of on-demand crowd that Amazon hosts. So Amazon has this division and this platform called Mechanical Turk, and it's the system where you can pay people like 35 cents to do these tiny, minuscule, self-contained online jobs. And at the time, I had been using it with a lot of other MIT students to create art and sort of weird hack projects. And I would even do things like I wrote some software that would look at how long I was spending on Facebook. And if I exceeded a certain time limit, I would automatically send a Mechanical Turk worker to call my phone and berate me for it. So you could do all these creative things. The main task people would do was really boring things like image classification. So people were using this to train machine learning. And my friends and I were just trying to find all the craziest things that we could do. One artist had people, you know, drawing sheep all facing the right, and he did, you know, had I think 100,000 images of sheep. Another friend of mine had them translate Moby Dick into emoji, which he called Emoji Dick. So it was this really great sort of, I consider it a creative tool more than anything. And it sort of had this neat feature where you really had to make your task dead simple. It had to be something that you could teach someone in about 5 minutes, and then only have the task be about a couple minutes long. So what I thought about doing was I would send my negative thought and my stressful situation, basically a modified thought record from CBT, but stripped down quite a bit. So I'd write down what was bothering me. Maybe I had a presentation to give and I was really anxious. And I would send it to Mechanical Turk, and I would get 5 people to look for different cognitive distortions and label them as such if they existed. And I would get another 5 people to try and come up with creative reframes for the thought. And then I would get some people just to empathize with me, which seemed really silly because, I'm paying someone to empathize with me. How effective can this be? But it actually felt really good, and people were describing, some similar problems they were having, and it was really compelling right out of the gates. But it took me probably 3 to 4 years to polish the edges till it was, something I would want to do research on.
Okay, so there's so much in this, Rob. There's so much in this story that's so compelling to me. I'm gonna bring Jonathan in just a sec because I want to hear his input. There's several things. One, I am extremely critical of psychology in general because we don't take a multidisciplinary approach. And one of the things that you're showing is how vital multidisciplinary efforts are. That in fact, if your specialty is just psychology and you don't have this tech background, or you just have a tech background and you don't have some psychology, it's really hard for us to find these really cool solutions because there's overlap in all our efforts now. There's nothing that lives in a vacuum anymore. The second thing I love about this, Rob, is that you're talking about how you were working on a solution to solve your own issues, improve yourself, address some of the things that you were struggling with, and you broke that down in a way that operationalized your own solution, which then leads to the possibilities of creating and expanding and scaling this out for other people. The other thing that's really key in this is that you were building in the Mechanical Turk functionality, these like recursions, right? We need to create something that's really easy to replicate and that can recreate itself as many times as we need to do it, which I think is just brilliant. And I don't think we think in those terms enough in terms of mental health and suicide prevention. Jonathan, what are your thoughts on this? Because I'm loving this.
Yeah, I'm loving this too. So well, one thought that popped to my mind was that Robbie, your experience of figuring out what worked for you, you've then gone on to create an app taking what worked for you, and it seems to be working for other people. And it reminds me of the story that Marsha Linehan told recently about how she came to develop dialectical behavior therapy, which is that she figured out what worked for her, and then she made it into an actual therapy. And so I think that's beautiful, and of course that's how it tends to have worked historically. People do what works for them. I love the piece about using Mechanical Turk, and I think that it's something that any of the mental health folks that are watching this should know about this. You can go on to Amazon and learn about it. And there's actually research on if you crowdsource for surveys and stuff like that, what does that mean in terms of methodology? But, I think it's a really powerful thing that we don't talk about much. Now, I do want to say you have to pay for it, which you didn't explicitly say, but it should be obvious for folks who are thinking about that. But I was wondering if we could move to this idea that you have crowdsourced support for yourself, and it was working for you because it sounded like it was not kind of deep-seated, change that needed to happen, but it was like there was a stressor about an upcoming presentation, which is a very different kind of sort of support than somebody that might be struggling with something, maybe a long-term trauma or something like that that's getting triggered over and over and over again and is really devastating them and keeping them from working. What are your thoughts on the use of Koko or other apps for dealing with this kind of different support?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, one thing I should clarify and sort of fill out the story is that, though I did find it helpful to get this sort of crowdsourced support on demand, and I did find that some pretty deep-seated issues I had sort of got unlocked with a certain type of phrasing or certain type of perspective. So I certainly don't think it's, a panacea that would work for everything, but we have a lot of stories of people having issues that they've struggled with for many, many years. And the beautiful thing about crowdsourcing is you have many people providing different perspectives, and it could be just that one that sort of unlocks you. It's sort of like handing a jar of pickles around to a bunch of people, and then one person gets sort of the right twist and the lid comes off. It's certainly not that easy for most people. But I will say that the thing that was most surprising, I think therapeutically, was actually not consuming help from the crowd, but rather being an active participant who was responding to other people. And I think that mechanic is really sort of the meaty ingredient, and we have some research showing that that's coming out tomorrow. And so I think our platform is better suited for teaching people a specific skill rather than sort of solving a specific problem. So the idea is to provide people one tool that is sort of a transdiagnostic tool. It's not the only tool in your toolkit, but we provide it in a way that we hope people can learn it very, very deeply and get into the marrow of their, sort of cognition and cognitive style. And I think mostly people get the benefit by turning it around and helping other people. So I started with Mechanical Turk workers, and I thought this would have to be something that would have to, require budget, and you'd have to pay for things. Very interestingly, the Mechanical Turk workers were leaving these comments saying things like, boy, this task was really interesting. I never, reflected on my thoughts that way. Like, I have some of these distortions all the time. This is amazing. And at that point, I'd done, hundreds of Mechanical Turk tasks, and this was the only task where I had people volunteering to do it for free. So once we did the clinical trial, with some kind of pushing from my academic collaborators, we decided to pull out Mechanical Turk entirely and just see if people, actually that kind of came after. That was once we did Koko. We did have some Turkers sort of supporting as a supporting role in the clinical trial, but we tried to move pretty quickly to just users helping each other.
So,
Well,
go ahead, Jonathan.
Oh, I was going to say that I was jumping ahead into Koko, but I think there are a couple things that you've brought up that are really important. One is that for mental health professionals, we often think about in order to get better. And what you're saying is that there is value in folks helping others, which is really hard for mental health professionals to facilitate in a traditional way, because we can't access other people, because then we'd be violating confidentiality. We can certainly support people to find others, right, that will support them and be a community. But this is really a way to find others in a very powerful and sort of expansive way. The other thing that I was thinking is that you made me, you reminded me of when I was a canvasser for Clean Water Action. I worked for a year organizing for the environment in Texas and San Francisco and Philadelphia. And we had to go door to door getting signatures on clipboards for local representatives, as well as to fundraise. And we had to learn 5 skills. And all of our job came down to 5 skills. And we had to support the person that was doing the other side of the street. And so we had 5 simple skills that we had to master, and that we then had to teach others to do, and that we had to support others to do. That very simple structure, that we were able to go out there and collectively as an organization raise millions of dollars and influence, legislation on war for the country. Something really powerful and really encouraging about thinking about being very specific and very concrete in saying, hey, focus on this or focus on that, that in and of itself can be useful.
So I think one of the things that we were getting at is this idea that helping others can help us, and I think we've been nibbling around the edges of that. That's something that you kind of discovered spontaneously, right? It was not something you set out to do, right, Rob? You just discovered it organically.
Yeah, that's right. I think I got some sort of like breadcrumbs that the Mechanical Turk workers were leaving, but when you have a research project and you have a certain vision of how it's supposed to go, it's sort of hard to kind of open up your thinking to new ideas. So it took me a little while, but it was pretty obvious once the system was running. To speak again of my own personal experience, it was something that was most provocative for me personally. So I lean towards the pessimism side of things. And coming up with reappraisals of situations has historically been very, very difficult for me. So even as someone who is building this sort of machine to help people do this, I was still struggling to come up with reframes for other people early on. And my wife is sort of the bright-sided optimist and always able to see multiple angles of things. She never kind of perseverates or gets stuck in a rut. So at first I was, hey Molly, can you give me some help over here? I'd kind of like, cheat off of her a little bit. But the structure of the app got more and more refined to the point where it became very easy to just kind of knock these things out over and over again while I'm standing in line for coffee or on the subway. And so you start building up this repertoire and this sort of mental muscle. And so I was feeling this very palpably personally, and I eventually outpaced my wife on these things. So I'm very proud of that, I'm now sort of the more flexible thinker in my family. So it was a sort of a personal revelation as well. After we did the clinical trial with MIT and Northwestern, a group at Columbia wanted to analyze the data separately, and a few of them tried the app at that point as well, and they were like, well, we think the most interesting thing is helping others on this platform. You're doing it in a very structured way. It's not sort of a free-form back and forth thing. You're specifically guiding and nudging people to practice this cognitive technique that has historically been shown to be pretty powerful. And it's very rewarding. You get these little thank you notes, and you feel like you've done this little creative act of generosity for people. And then following that, we just started getting feedback from users. And if you actually, there's a link, I think it's kokolovelletters.tumblr.com. It's linked on our main webpage. It's koko.com, and you can read this feedback we get that's unsolicited. It comes into email. Sometimes actually people send letters. And I would say 2/3 of it is people saying that they've discovered this sort of eureka moment of, hey, actually the most helpful thing is helping others on this platform. So it's a pretty common refrain. And then the last couple of years, we've done further research to see whether that aspect of the system is what best predicts reduction in depression symptoms and some other outcome measures.
And Rob, I think this is vital, because I think one of the things you've talked about is incremental versus scalable. And I think one of the things that's really key to me is that the more I learn about mental health and suicide prevention and well-being, is that human beings, one of the important things about us is that we have a need to be helpful and have purpose. We need to feel useful, right? And that in fact, many of the things that are ailing us is that we don't feel connected, we don't feel useful, and that really can drag us down, and then things kind of snowball, right? And it gets it, one of the things that, we were just talking about, Jonathan was talking about, well, this wasn't necessarily take care of big issues, but somebody, Chris Coombs, who's watching, he said, but we forget how these little struggles that we have, how powerful they are, particularly when they mount over time, right? The second piece of this that I think is really important is that when we teach people and when people have success overcoming small things, they are more confident about then having success over slightly bigger things, and then they're more successful at those things. And then all of a sudden now they're feeling like they can handle these even bigger things in their life, right? So we do this kind of, it's self-efficacy, right? Instead of being focused on self-esteem, we're focusing on self-efficacy, which I think is vital. So I'm going to share, when I was reading about your story and about Koko's story and all the amazing things you've done, it was very inspirational. And I read through the letters, the love letters to Koko, which were fascinating. I'm like, I'm going to go ahead and try the app. So I got on the app this morning, and it was really easy on Messenger. You just go on Messenger. I mean, it was incredibly easy how quickly I just had the interface there, and it prompted me through it, right? Really user-friendly. And it said, well, what's your problem? And then even in describing the problem, it asked me then, well, what's the worst thing that could happen about this? And what do you think the best way to view this is? So even as I'm describing my problem, it's kind of pushing me a little bit, right? Making me think of things a little bit differently. But then my favorite part was, well, okay, we'll wait for responses, but while you wait, do you want to help somebody else? And I'm like, let's do that. And so what was really interesting is that, so I read somebody else's posted problem. And the first thing that occurred to me, and then it gives you some instructions about how you go about helping people and be positive and help them reappraise. It needs to be supportive and not giving advice. And I read through this really long problem, and the first thing I wanted to say was, you just need to get out of this particular situation because this really sucks, right? And I'm a clinician, and my first response is personally is, yeah, this is really bad. But then as you read through the rules, there's this gamification element, right? That there's a challenge here. You can't just tell people what to do. There's something else that works. And so I had to work through the strategy, and my first response was too long, and my second response was too long, and the interface kept working with me and saying, no, that's good, but it's still, we need to tighten it up a little bit. And then, so by the time I got my response down, right, and I got it to where it was, I realized that I had a bunch of extra junk in there that I didn't need. I came up with a decent response, submitted it, and by the time I got done submitting my response, there were responses to my problem waiting for me. And it said, hey, do you want to see these? And I'm like, sure. And I got these really helpful, right, and genuine and caring responses to the problem that I had posted. So, and I was already distracted and feeling better from helping somebody else, right? And then in the meantime of getting responses to my problem, I'm now getting response to the advice or the help I gave, saying, thank you, that really helped me think about it a different way. So it was interesting to me how much love and positive reinforcement and skill building was built into this really short, like 15 minutes of exchanges, had this really positive impact on my mood. And it occurred to me that a lot of design and a lot of thought went into this. This didn't just happen. You guys had to really think about this. And I'd love to hear how you worked all these out.
Yeah, it did take a long time. I don't even know, like, it's just a long slog of incremental design changes. So, you know, I think sort of the metaphor I kind of use with this platform is bumper bowling. So, you know, bumper bowling, you don't want to throw gutter balls, but you have some room to kind of weave back and forth. And one of the like core design challenges we have is being too explicit and too sort of dictatorial about, you must do this. But if we're too open-ended, things go off the rails very, very quickly. So there's this balance of trying to give people enough room to be creative and generate that feeling of self-efficacy, but also not throwing gutter balls. And to get that kind of balance, I don't think we'll ever achieve the perfect balance. It's very difficult. And, you know, we've done all sorts of things to try and do this. We try and make the experience as simple as possible on the surface and abstract out the complexity. So we do that a couple ways. One is we do use a fair bit of machine learning. So you experienced some sort of real-time nudging and extra tutorials. We could have spent a long time beforehand belaboring how long your thing needs to be and reminding people over and over again. But you know, if you have all these rules up front, people aren't going to read through them. So what seems to work better is on demand in real time. If someone sort of misses the mark or colors outside the lines, let's have the machine kind of nudge them in that moment, rather than trying to dump this massive set of rules on people at once. So we do things like, yes, we'll check how long things are, but we do even more subtle things. So we have, for example, if people are giving pretty blunt or sort of rude responses, even if they're well-intentioned, we have multiple layers of classifiers. We of course get rid of malicious and trolling behavior, but we're also sensitive to people who are trying to be helpful but are just pretty abrasive. So if our machine catches that, we won't kind of correct you or chastise you, but we'll say, hey, that's great. Let's add one more thing. Let's just, tell the person something really hopeful and nice, and we give you kind of an easier ask, and the machine sort of filters out your stumbles beforehand. So a lot of it is trying to build upon machine learning to interject and change the experience and adjust the scaffolding as needed, so that it feels more simple. It's definitely also a design challenge. How do you come back and ask people to adjust some of their content is very, very difficult. And even things like how we word things. So how we word a phrase like, what's a more positive take on this? Took probably hundreds of iterations, and we even use Mechanical Turk for that. We'd ask people to, we'd give them a prompt and we'd see what people would come back with. And it turns out that certain types of words and certain phrasings just sort of happen to work for people and they understand the concept rather than others. So it's just a whole, laborious process of trial and error. We do a lot of in-person user testing, so we'll watch people struggle and get frustrated and do kind of qualitative research and ask them what's going on, as well as a lot of quantitative research, trying to see where people are struggling in the experience.
Okay, this is important. This is key, because what I experienced worked very smoothly. And what you're saying is, yeah, it did, but it took a whole lot of work and a lot of iterations and testing to kind of get this thing to work as smoothly as it does, right? It wasn't out of the box like that, so to speak. So one of the things I'm curious about, and I have some theories, haven't been involved with some focus groups and learning more about machine learning. I have a sense that sometimes people say that they want this, but that in practice, actually what works is that, right? That in fact, our stated preference for things and what actually reinforces us or keeps us engaged may be different than what we're consciously aware of or reporting. And I wonder if you found any of that kind of the interplay between some of the qualitative feedback you've gotten and the data about what's working and what isn't. How do those mesh? And I don't know if that makes sense or if that's just, yeah.
Yeah, I think I think maybe I'll twist your question a little, so I can best answer it. But there's certainly a trade-off of what users want and think will work, and versus what we find empirically to perform better. So I think the biggest source of friction we get with our users is they want to have open-ended chat with people. So one thing I like to kind of our system is it is peer support, but I feel it's more of a means to an end. The peer support isn't necessarily the end. For people, it's sort of a gateway drug or delivery mechanism to get people to sort of work on some other skills. But people really want to have long form back and forth chat, and that kind of devolves very quickly. It becomes very hard to moderate. We have really robust classifiers, but running them on every single exchange in a long open-ended chat is very difficult. So that's one thing. I think a lot of people also, their lay intuition, I think as you described, is to try and solve the person's problem. We try and structure the post so the sort of things you're submitting don't really lend themselves to that. So we even have classifiers that will look if you're asking a question. So if you're asking a question like, should I, increase my lorazepam to 2 milligrams, that will not go on Koko. But if someone asks that, there's really no way to reframe that. You're gonna just jump in and give direct advice. So I think a lot of users on our service, the hardest thing for them is to sort of go around their intuition, which is to just try and solve the problem. And I think that's works perfectly well in other contexts, and maybe different versions of Koko could have more active problem-solving components. It's not as if I'm against that per se at all, but we don't know much about the context of what people are dealing with. So when you get people jumping in and trying to serve up explicit step-by-step instructions for how to overcome something, they often, miss the mark or extrapolate a fair bit. I think even despite this, there's still people who will give direct advice, and through a lot of experience on the platform, we realize there's really no sort of binary distinction between giving someone a concrete plan of what to do and giving someone a new way of thinking about things. There's a huge gray area. So those are sort of the tensions, and probably the best way we've done to resolve them is to get the community itself to talk about this. So when we first had an iOS app, we had a sort of meta community on top of the community where people would talk about these things. And people would say, well, I want to give advice. And other people would say, well, that belies the whole point of this very simple exercise that we're all doing. And we let people sort of discuss it and learn from them and try and see how best to resolve some of these tensions between what people think will work versus what we as kind of designers and creators want to impose. And then finally, we need to, as designers and even clinicians, need to leave some room to be surprised by things and let the data speak for itself. And I think that's one of the great opportunities with more digital tools, is having these sort of serendipitous moments where something that maybe isn't springing directly from some theoretical point of view is showing some positive results that you wouldn't expect. So you need to kind of be open to those moments as well, I believe.
I think that's...
So Rob.
Yeah, jump in, John.
Oh, yeah. So thank you so much for giving us such insight into the background and how this platform came about, the multiple levels. I think it's helpful for anybody who's thinking, oh, I'm just going to go out there and design an app that's going to be super helpful to a lot of people. You're debunking that myth. You're also saying that you've used crowdsourcing in lots of different ways, right? So not just sort of anonymous MTurk crowdsourcing, but also sort of a group of key constituents who are like, yeah, I'm really into this. And I think of them as sort of like Wikipedia editors who are really dedicated to making sure that this works. Can you talk about what has happened when people have talked about suicide on Koko or Panoply? What are the discussions you guys have had about that? How have you addressed it? And what are the prompts or the responses that come up now?
Yeah, sure. So that was something that was part of the project from its very beginning. So especially once it started veering into a research project somewhere around 2012, that was part of our discussion with the IRB initially, trying to anticipate this scenario. And I really think our IRB at MIT was really great to work with. I think a lot of other institutions wouldn't have greenlit this type of project, but we started with using crowdsourcing to look for those kinds of scenarios. So every post and response going on to the network was vetted by at least 3 people in real time. So something like Mechanical Turk is pretty good for that. If you use it in a very, very sophisticated way, you need to make sure your workers have great language skill. You need to make sure they pass a whole bunch of sort of qualification tasks and so forth. So it started as being a human-powered endeavor. And when we were working on Koko as well, the founders ourselves were also helping with that kind of moderation queue. And our decision ultimately was to not surface that content on the network, primarily for the reason that there are a whole host of people that are coming onto this platform, and the majority of them probably aren't comfortable or qualified to be exposed to that content or know what to do. So at one level, it's sort of a user experience problem for the network. And then, we wanted to make sure if anyone is posting something that seems alarming, that we get them to more high-touched Lifeline resources. So this is something that was sort of baked in at the beginning, but it is one of our great sources of pride now, how our system has evolved and what we've done, and some of our partnerships with groups like Crisis Text Line. So now we use a lot more machine learning to do this. So that was a really interesting and complex task. So the first thing we had to kind of do is operationalize, what do we mean by a user in crisis? How do we know when to send a person to a lifeline and reach out to them in a very delicate way and not let their content necessarily surface? And I think that's one thing about machine learning that's often not discussed, is the very first step in a classification task is you need to know what the hell you mean by something like crisis. And that takes a lot of work and a lot of effort, and it's this messy sort of iterative process. We eventually landed on a phrasing that seems to capture most of what we, we construe it to be, and I think there's room for other construals as well. But we consider it as someone in the post. Doesn't have to be the person who posted, but someone mentioned seems to be in imminent risk of serious physical harm. And so that gets at a lot of different things. Imminent risk is important because if someone says, I attempted suicide 2 years ago, I've made a lot of strides, but I'm still struggling to relate to my family, we don't want to quarantine that content. That's great content for our network. So our machine learning has to be sensitive to past versus imminent. We also make a distinction between physical harm versus bullying. So if someone's at risk of bullying, that's different. But we also have to do things like make a distinction. We have to make sure our classifiers are looking for people, who say, my best friend just swallowed a whole bottle of Advil. We need to make sure that triggers our protocols as well. So there's a lot of effort to get the construct and then get hundreds of thousands of labels for our machine to say this is a positive exemplar, this is a negative exemplar. And then use things like deep learning to train the machine to do this. So in practice, though, we still have humans. So basically what we do is we say, we'll look at text coming in, and if our machine classifier is 99.5% confident, it thinks it knows the answer, we'll go ahead and let it rule. Anything below that, we kick it out to a human or set of humans. And that's really great pipeline, because they then start building labels that help address these edge cases that the machine wasn't understanding. So we feed that back in. So if someone says, I want to defenestrate myself, I think a lot of our machine learning can catch that, but there are certain phrases that may trip it up, and we can then use that in our training set. So there's a whole host of things we've done to adapt our classifiers for this task, and then maybe even more importantly is how do we reach out to the person? What language do we use? If someone is at high risk, how do we make sure they actually use the resource? So we're doing a couple interesting things there now. So if someone trips one of these flags on our end, we say, we're concerned about you. Sounds like you're struggling. Is that correct? Yes or no? We then try and get them to describe, what they're dealing with. Is it suicide? Is it self-harm? Is it an eating disorder? Are they experiencing physical abuse from someone? Sexual abuse? And we go through a little modified protocol to try and get a sense of the urgency. In all cases, we'll send people to a lifeline in their country. But one thing we did in the last couple months is, we collect a lot of data. So once we send people a link to a lifeline, 5 hours later, we message them again and say, hey, we sent you this link to a lifeline. How was that experience for you? Was this okay, bad, etc.? And we get qualitative data on that. They'll sort of say what was going on, and then we ask them, did you use the resource? And ask them, why or why not? And there's already been literature on why people, some of the barriers that prevent people from using these lifelines. We were able to sort of independently get a lot of that information from tens of thousands of people. We got data from, and a lot of our teen audience was convinced that as soon as they reach out to a lifeline, be it text or phone, the police would come immediately. So what we did was, as soon as we give people a lifeline now, we say, okay, how likely are you to use this? And they can choose very likely or not likely. And if they say not likely, we say, well, that makes sense. A lot of other users on here have had some concerns. Here are some concerns that come up. I don't want the police to be called. I don't like mental health professionals. It's going to be too overwhelming. And then you can tap through that, and we try and sort of dispel some of the myths and things. And we were able to, because of our outcome measures, track whether that improved self-reported crisis line utilization. And that was probably the most profound effect we found in our product to date. The rates just skyrocketed once we added that extra piece of saying, hey, a lot of users like you had these concerns. Here's just some thoughts about them. It made a profound difference. I don't know whether, we don't have behavioral data. So this is self-report. So as a scientist, I always have to say, who knows whether they're actually utilizing these resources more, but I'm hopeful that they are, and I'm hopeful that, iterative design and constantly getting outcome measures can help improve things further in this way.
Rob, Rob, I have to tell you, I don't know if you realize what a source of information and amazing stuff you are. There's so much packed in here. We could do 2 or 3 shows on what you're doing easily. And so I want to, because one of the things that's really important, because I could spend an hour on what you just talked about because I want to know more, but we're going to move on. One of the things that's very cool is that there's a huge problem with app abandonment and app fatigue, right? And all these kind of standalone networks. And you guys are really starting to bridge the gap, which I think is the future, which is kind of connecting and collaborating with existing platforms where people already are, rather than trying to get people to join this standalone app. Let's go where they already are, which is what I think we really need to be doing. So please tell us about some of the things that you're working on. What's the future? How are you working with our agencies? What are the big things that you're excited about? What's the future?
Yeah, great question. I am profoundly excited about this. So we started as an iOS app, and it just didn't feel right. We were doing a lot of user research in tandem, where we would go on to Twitter, an app like Whisper, which is a confessional app, where you get a lot of sort of Koko-like content happening naturally. And we were interviewing really hundreds of people who were posting essentially negative thoughts out on these social networks. And what we were finding was that these individuals aren't going to go download a stress reduction app, certainly not a depression app. They're not going to sign up for a meditation course. They're not going to do a 12-week CBT course, at least in the landscape we see today. What they are doing is they're using the networks they visit every day, and they're hacking them in a sense to get emotional support. And in some cases, this is sort of an impulsive moment for them. They're really overwhelmed, and they're on Twitter already, and they just disclose something pretty vulnerable, or in some cases pretty alarming. If you go on to Instagram right now, if you search for depression, you'll see well over 10 million posts with that tag. People are using these networks to reach out for help. And so we started working with some of these networks to see whether we could bring the service to people at the moment they're most willing and open to try it, rather than expecting people to sort of read a Wired article, remember the name of an app, go download the app. While it's being downloaded, not forget that you're downloading it, because you're going to go back on Twitter and Facebook. And to be honest, like, the landscape of apps has changed really dramatically in the last, even couple years. People used to be more promiscuous with app usage. They used to, use a handful of apps, but the big behemoths, the Facebooks, the Twitters, the Snapchats, managed to out-design everybody, and everybody's motor memory goes to those 4 apps. They're not, using these other apps. So that's why we're baking our services directly into these services. That's why we've transitioned to mostly a messaging platform. So you can now access us in the direct messaging, private direct messaging on Twitter. It's in Facebook Messenger. We have certain bot instantiations on a network called Kik, which is a huge network for teens. If they're talking to a bot and they reveal themselves to be in distress, they say, I'm really depressed, my girlfriend left me, and they're talking to like the Justin Bieber bot or the MTV bot, the bot will say, well, I'm not sure I can help you there, but these guys might help you. And there's this really elegant handoff where the teens are tapping in at really high conversion rates and submitting posts on our network. And we have what I believe to be one of the most rare elements of the universe, which is a teen's undivided attention. So it's really, you know, our opportunity to take hold of that and do as best we can. You know, we're getting people coming in and openly curious and interested in trying this thing that's being housed and hosted on a network that they trust and are familiar with. And it's great for the networks too. We find that you know, people who use a service in these networks feel more affinity for the network that hosts it. So there's incentive for them to embed services like this, and I hope more of that continues.
Okay, that is so unbelievably cool. And there's a couple things we're getting up on final thoughts, and we're gonna start final thoughts with Jonathan. But one thing you talked about conversion rate, and folks don't realize how big of a challenge getting folks online to convert to some other service or some other aid is. Like, it's not uncommon to see a 1 to 2% conversion rate, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're saying you've got a good conversion rate. Can you share your conversion rate? Can you tell us what that is?
It depends on the network, so it's very different, and in some cases we don't actually know how many people from the network got sent to us. So in some cases, like I think Tumblr, we're not really necessarily privy to how many people got surfaced a link to Koko. But what we look at most importantly is looking at a couple things that are really key for us is of people who go onto this app, how many people go on to make a post? How many people then go on to compose a reply for others? How many people then get a thank you note? That's sort of the aha moment. If someone goes through that whole cycle and gets a thank you note, they're going to be in it for a while. So on a service like Vent, which is one where people are already sort of talking about emotions, it's a teen audience. Our handoff there to Koko is very well structured. There's a lot of social proof. The app itself is sort of touting the value of this. The network and the peers are touting the value of it. When people come through that channel, we're seeing an astounding 80% go on to make a post, which is insane to have people. And these are legitimate posts. These are not, we don't look at posts that get quarantined. And a lot of our posts do get quarantined. On something like Kick, it's a little less. I think it's somewhere around 60–50%. And there's a lot of noise, so it's hard to interpret these things. So it depends on the quality of your referral. If people are coming through a noisy channel, there may be people who this is not a good fit for in any stretch of the imagination. So that affects your conversion rate too. So really, the more important thing for us is of people who post, how many people go on to reply. Probably our most amazing conversion stat right now is of people we've identified as being in crisis, quote unquote, how we define it, and being in the US, that gets served a link to crisis text line that lets them chat within Kick. So they don't have to text, they don't have to go elsewhere, they just get a link. So it says, okay, we think you should check out crisis text line, you're in the United States. We are getting somewhere around 95–98% people who surface that link, click on it. So that's been really wonderful for us.
Rob, that's incredible. I mean, that's incredible. So we're nearing the end of our time. Tony is giving up his final thoughts because he's a mensch and a wonderful human being. Jonathan, final thoughts.
Yeah. So this hour has been a masterclass in how mental health providers and I think anybody interested in helping people should be thinking about not just the technology side of it, but also sort of getting outside of the office in terms of what actually makes a difference. And the discussion of metrics and how we think about what's working, what's not. I mean, it is the future. So, Rob, I'm so grateful for you being here. And I would love for us to book you again to talk all about kids because you are dropping little hints about what it's like to be in an ecosystem with kids and teens and adolescents and young adults. And I think this is sort of, where we need to be thinking about in terms of technology. So thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Great discussion, great questions. And a teaser for kids is the story of how it took us 3 months to build classifiers to wrangle the Kik network. That was quite an effort on our part.
So I'm going to do a real quick wrap up. I was really psyched about doing the show. Reading about it, getting on and using the actual interface was amazing. Rob, what you're talking about is so relevant to what we're trying to accomplish in terms of scalable suicide prevention, that the amount of goodness and information coming out of you, I got to about a fifth to a fourth of what I really wanted to talk about, because there's so much there. So I know you're super busy, but just if you're willing to come back, there are people saying, please get Rob to come back. We would love to have you back. This was incredible. And I believe this is the future of suicide prevention and mental health, where we have this blend of peer-to-peer, mechanical interfaces, artificial intelligence, all merging together and scaling this thing out. And I think it's incredible. And for you, sir, I would love for you to have the last word on the show.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'd be happy to come back. I'm pleased that you're interested. And, I would just end by saying, we have a lot to learn and a lot to work on ourselves, and interacting with as many groups like you as possible is invaluable for us. So, it's useful for me to join these discussions and kind of hear more about what interests you guys the most. And critical feedback, of course, is very, very welcome in our company. So things that you think we could be doing differently or suggestions are heartily welcomed. Because I think, no one's going to have the perfect tool, and anyone who says so, you should be very skeptical of. So, it's something we need to work on with as many people as possible to move the needle as much as we can.
Rob, thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Please thank your team for the hard work they're doing. It's making a difference. The product is really, those of you out in SPSM land, get out there and try it. If you go to the Twitter direct message, if you go to Messenger on Facebook, and just, I think if you just type in or go to the website, it'll link you right in, and check it out, because it's really impressive. So Rob, thank you so much. Thank you, SPSM. We are back next week. Same normal time. This was a special time. We'll be back at 9 p.m. Central, and Doc Foreman will be back. So love you all, and good night. Thank you.